Sa may number, engineer tayo this
Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I am the actor.
I'm Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer. So today, it's Tenet Day.
Here we go.
Maybe every day is Tenet Day. I don't know. So Tenet is a film that just came out. It's Christopher Nolan's most recent film. Just came out on Blu-ray and 4K, Ultra HD disc and digital download. So we're finally going to be able to talk about it since neither one of us saw it in the theater. Just a quick plot summary. I'm just going to use the IMDb plot summary because it's as cryptic as the film itself. Armed with only one word, Tenet, and fighting for the survival of the entire world, a protagonist journeys through a twilight world of international espionage on a mission that will unfold into something beyond real time. Now, I don't know who wrote that, but it doesn't really tell you anything about the movie. And I think that we're going to try to do a very quick section here at the beginning where we will talk about our general impressions of the film without giving anything away or without getting spoilery. But I think most of this podcast is going to be very spoiler heavy. So if you haven't seen the film, my opinion is I think you should see it because I think it is super interesting. I really enjoyed it the first time I watched it, even though I had a lot of questions, and I enjoyed it even more the second time I watched it. How about you?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It's a puzzle. And, I don't really get into puzzles, but when it comes to a movie puzzle, I'm in. And it comes down to one good idea. We've talked about this a million times before, where just the idea alone will set the rest of the movie in motion. And I'm not sure that 100% applies here, but it's definitely an interesting concept. And Christopher Nolan has been the concept guy in a couple of his movies. And to me, just the thought alone of how it all works is interesting, but I'm not sure it lends itself to, let's put it this way, an easygoing movie experience. There are espionage movies and action adventure films that you're trying to figure out as you're going along. And if you figure it out, you're like, I think that's what's happening. I think this is what's happening. Oh, no, that's what's happening. Oh, I thought that, but I didn't, that kind of thing. I found myself wrapped in the concept of inversion more interesting than anything else when it came to the narrative. So I was trying to figure out, like you said, spoilers. I mean, it's impossible to talk about this movie, and I'm not going to say anything specific, but if the concept is there is inversion created in the future. In other words, they can send things back to the past, and that means it's inverted, so it acts backwards.
The biggest thing that we have to say is that it's not a time travel movie. This movie is not a time travel movie. It's a spy movie, and it's not a time travel movie. Those are the two things I think we need to get through before we start getting into spoilers.
Yeah, you got a point. So when you're watching an action sequence, you're watching it for the conclusion. Do they get the bomb? Do they not get the bomb? Do they save the girl? Do they not save the girl? Does she save them? Does she not save them? That kind of thing. For this, I'm watching who's going backwards, who's going forward, and whether or not that all adds up. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It pulls you out of the film, in my opinion, but it's definitely an intelligent action film.
Yeah, to me, I just love being able to be given rules and be given a structure and then try to push against that structure with questions and see where it fails. And every time I pushed against it, there was something that explained it, whether it was a piece of dialogue or whether it was an action or how it was portrayed on screen visually or the signposts that were used to represent time moving forward or time moving backwards. But ultimately, it's one of those things where you have to take your mind frame and separate yourself from how you've lived your whole life, which is you moving forward and everything else around you moving forward, and then put yourself in a scenario where there's a potential that in this fake world that Christopher Nolan has created, there's a potential for you to be able to still be moving forward, but everything around you is moving backwards. And you are just experiencing the world in a different way. And once I kind of unlocked that, that energized me and that engaged me a lot more. And I was able to at least be a lot more analytical with this film, which I love. I mean, there may be certain things that I will gloss over as far as, I don't know, maybe it's performances or certain small things that I don't really care about as much because this movie has too much stuff for me to focus on that is based on the plot and the mechanics of how this going forward and going backwards works in this world and how it all intertwines. And you're right, it is a puzzle movie. I do love it how a jigsaw puzzle, you start with a bunch of disparate pieces, and by the end it all fits together. It's all bound into one singular piece that forms a full picture. And I think that for me, this movie does that, and I really enjoy that. And I will keep watching it. I've watched it twice so far, but and other certain parts of it multiple times just to kind of clarify for myself. But I just love being able to dissect things and then still have the ability to have an answer and not make things up on my own to try to qualify it, but be able to go back and see evidence within the movie that verifies a particular theory. So yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, I'm into that too. But this movie, we thought we had the answers. It was the questions we had wrong. There's so many questions. I don't have time the first time I'm watching it to try to see if things add up because of a line or because of an action or because of something that you saw at one point. There's a red thread at the end of the film, literally, that means something that happened a little while ago. And it's almost a little tiresome or troublesome that you have to remember what that was about because that means something else in the future is going to be affected by that, and then that means something in the narrative is going to be affected by that. It's challenging, it's complicated without being convoluted, but the enjoyable part for me was to almost try to trip it up and try to figure out where there was a flaw, and that's not good for understanding a narrative. Once you realize what the idea is or the concept is, it's hard to, when things are going backwards and forwards at the same time, it's hard to follow the plot lines because I'm trying to figure out, well, wait a second, if he went in there and he came out there, does that mean that's backwards, that's forward? Where are we at right now? And that to me is probably why most people are confused about this film. To me, that was kind of an enjoyable thing to try to figure out what was what. But when it came to following through to the aha at the end, oh, that's what it was. It takes a little bit of more of a struggle in your mind than I think that the aha moment at the end is worth, if that makes sense. Because what ends up happening, and I guess when it comes to this kind of film, it doesn't matter if we talk about the beginning and the end and all that other stuff, because spoiler alert, from this point on, because I don't know if I can talk about this movie without talking about stuff like that. Because the beginning of the film is the end of the film and vice versa, is what you find out. And you spend a lot of time. It's 2.5 hours, which is a lengthy film for something as complex as this. I don't know if it's 100% necessary to be that long. Nothing about the length of time bothered me, meaning the film's length of time. See, it's starting to get confusing just to talk about it in the real world. Or is this the real world? So was it justified at the end of the film how much sped up very quickly that you find out in the last 10 minutes of the movie? Was it justifiable that it was 2.5 hours to get to that? I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see it a second time, but I would like to watch it a second time doing the opposite of what I did the first time. I want to watch it for plot lines and narrative trajectories. You know, I want to see how the movie goes instead of trying to figure out, wait, if Robert Pattinson goes that way and John David Washington goes that way, does that mean they got to come out that way? You know, that's what my mind was doing. So it's going to be interesting to watch it a second time. It's going to be challenging, but I think it's worth it. I think. I'm not 100% sure.
You're bringing up interesting points, and I think that for me, I will kind of gloss over all of those and be like, I knew going into Tenet the first time I watched it, I was going to watch it multiple times, and I just was strapped in, ready to go. I'm ready and willing to be confused the first time I watched the movie, and then not as confused the second time, and even less confused the third time, and going on and on and on. And I was willing to go online and do research and watch YouTube videos and all that stuff. That's a big commitment. And I think that there are certain people watching movies that just want to unplug for a couple hours and they want to just be entertained. And I think this movie does have elements of entertainment separate from the plot and separate from the mechanics of the film, the score being one of them, which is really great by Ludwig Göransson. And just the visual eye candy that they put on screen is also amazing. So there's really interesting things separate from the plot. But I think that for me, I was a lot more committed than someone else may be. And that may be a frustrating movie-going experience. Steph and I watched it together a few days ago, and she fell asleep. And I can't necessarily blame her for that, she just wasn't interested enough to stay engaged past points that might have been confused or might have been confusing, and points that might have been contentious upon first viewing. But then when you think about something that happened earlier in the movie, it's like, oh, that does make sense. But maybe you just don't want to have to go through that. And so the big question I have for you is that we're living in a world now where it's so easy to watch a movie multiple times. I think if this movie would have come out 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it would have been kind of mean to the movie going public, because it's a lot harder to go see a movie multiple times unless you actually go to the theater to see it. Versus right now, it's very easy to watch a movie streaming and then turn it right around and watch it again and just watch it again. So I think that maybe Nolan understands that he's working in a different medium now than he would have been 40 years ago. So is it mean of him to make a movie like this? Is it malicious to the audience?
I'm not sure. I think that's a good question. And that's an interesting way to put that. Yes and no, because is he obligated to understand that an audience needs to see something multiple times in order to understand it? Or is he only obligated in his concept? And if his concept is too complicated, once again, complicated, not convoluted, because it all seems to add up. I think
it does.
I'm still.
Oh, we'll get into it if you want to.
Well, then I trust that.
But yeah,
I'll trust that, because I trust you when it comes to things like that. And I'm sure instinctually I believe that, but I don't know. I don't know if a filmmaker nowadays has to take into consideration the fact that an audience can see it 100 times. That said, it probably would have been a better film experience for me if all of that stuff had been figured out in advance. In other words, did he ever rely on the fact of, well, right here, this doesn't make much sense. He said it will the second time you see it. If he says things like that, Christopher Nolan says things like that, I'm not sure that's good, because a movie-going experience should be that storytelling process for that 2.5 hours or that 2 hours or that whatever it is. Just like reading a book. Once upon a time, you want to be fulfilled in that experience. Now, it might take you a little time to read that book all the way to the end, but you're still being fulfilled with that particular experience. So I don't know if I'm making sense out of this, but maybe if you just put me in reverse, it'll make sense. I'm not sure. I don't think that he's obligated to make his movie make sense the first time if it's as complicated as this storyline is. But you're right. This movie is so complicated in the beginning. There are so many things happening that if you miss it and you can't go back and listen to it again or watch it again, you're out of luck. You're not going to understand some of the significant things that happen immediately at the end of the movie. So I don't know if he's obligated to that. I don't know if he even considered it. I do wish it was a little bit simpler so we can enjoy the plot line with the concept. I think it starts to get muddled. To take into consideration that you can watch something multiple times, I don't think is a good idea. I think your idea for your story should be all-encompassing in itself. You're not watching Goldilocks and the Three Bears again after you're told the story. You're told the story and you understand everything that you need to know about that story in amongst itself. I think he relied on the intelligence of the audience nowadays. They're savvy, they're smart, they're up to date with modern technology.
There's also you can look at an audience in a couple different ways. You can play to the least common denominator, and I know that we've talked about this even in the recent past. You can play to the least common denominator, or you can put something out there that expects or requires a higher level of focus, and then expect your audience to rise to that, as opposed to not expecting anything of your audience, to the point where there are certain things. You talked about some of these signposts that he uses in the film. One of them is a little token tethered to a backpack. I mean, that is something that he uses traditional filmmaking tricks to the audience on that from the very first scene. The very first scene at the opera, when John David Washington's character, called the protagonist in this film, is saved. He's about to be killed, and he's saved by a mysterious soldier person in a mask. And when that soldier turns around and runs away, there's a wider shot of that person running away, and then there's a tight shot. It cuts to a tight shot of the guy's backpack as he's running away, and you see the token on his backpack. And that is a very traditional way of signaling to the audience, this is important. Otherwise, if he wouldn't have pushed in on that backpack and on that token, then you probably wouldn't have noticed it. I'm sure there's other things in the film that are a lot more subtle that will come in as you frame by frame go through something and be like, oh, look at that. But at the same time, he's not trying to make it super difficult to understand every single plot point. He does use exposition, especially the scene where the protagonist goes to the scientists to see what these inverted rounds are and to try to understand at least the basic building blocks of this new world in which time inversion is possible. And so that I think is another way for Nolan to impart this information. But ultimately, she even says, don't try to think about it. And I don't know if that's a kind of a wink to the audience, maybe for the first time, to be like, okay, this is going on. Don't try to think about it too much, because it will become more apparent to you later on in the film. Once you see the film, just the way that the film is structured, the film, I mean, they talk about it all the time. It's a temporal pincer movement. Well, we start with the protagonist at the film and he knows nothing. And by the end of the film, he's only halfway through his journey. By the end of the 2.5 hours that we see, he's only halfway through his life journey in this mission. And so that is something that we have to keep in mind. And then when we see the Robert Pattinson character for the first time, he's almost done with his journey. So time is not the same for each character. And that is a difficult thing to tell an audience, at least from the very beginning of the film. You pretty much have to just allow that to be revealed to the audience as they watch the film. So yeah, it's difficult, but I think that makes me wonder what his standing is going to be with Warner Brothers, and if he's going to be able to get another $205 million to make a movie like this in the future, just based on the fact that this was one of the first movies that was delayed and then ultimately was released in theaters in August, September. And it made $58 million, or has made $58 million domestically, and worldwide it's made only about $360 million. So it's not even close to making its budget back. I know the budget's 205 and it's made a total of 360, but usually when you have a $200 million movie, the amount of advertising and everything that goes along with that is about the same amount. So you can expect that Warner Brothers spent about $400 million on this movie and it's only made back $360 million. So it's definitely not profitable. And I'm sure it would have made a lot more money if it were not 2020. But I also wanted to get your opinion on like what you think this particular movie has done to theatrical releases, because Warner Brothers pretty much did an about face and said, we're going to release all of our movies on HBO Max and in theaters at the same time, which effectively cuts the legs out of any theatrical release for the next year. So I don't know if that was in direct response to their experience with Tenet in the theaters or what, but that to me is an extreme move.
The only way I can look at that and think about that is Wonder Woman 1984 opens on Christmas Day. Okay, and it says in theaters and on HBO Max. Well, I have HBO Max, so but what's going to happen if there's an outbreak at a movie theater on Christmas Day because they pack the theaters, because that's what people do on Christmas Day. It's a tradition for some families. Then there's a coronavirus outbreak. How is the studio going to recoup from that? It would be my concern. So I don't know if Tenet had anything to do with what Warner Brothers' decisions were. I have no idea. I can't imagine this complex of a movie being an entertaining experience in the middle of a pandemic when people haven't been going to the theaters on a regular basis. This is not the movie I would want to go back and see for the first time. It's too much. That experience is too much. Now, we've sort of talked off podcast about this, and I think you've even asked me when we've been recording what I'm going to do. And I'm going to follow the CDC. I'm going to follow what Dr. Fauci says. He says it's probably going to be a year or so before he feels comfortable going back to the theaters. And once he does that, he's probably still going to wear a mask, even though he's vaccinated, so forth and so on. I'm going to follow those rules. But it's like anything in life. You don't know how you're going to feel until you're in the middle of the experience. So I don't know. It's not that I'm afraid of going back to theaters because of getting the virus. I'm afraid that I will be paranoid the whole time and it will be a wasteful experience. It's Mecca for me. We love movies. I love going to the theater, but we've also talked about how particular I am about going to the theater. I like to go during the day. I like to sit around nobody. I don't like to be close to people. I don't like to go opening night. I don't like a big crowd unless it's a certain type of movie. And hopefully the crowd's into the movie, because I've been to, I think it was Rogue One. I saw opening night, and it was like a Saturday night or something, and it was packed. And if they were in it, I would have been okay with that. But a lot of people were just having, a date night or a popcorn movie night. So they're not as conducive to just hunkering down in the seat and following the movie. So my experience during a pandemic is not about being in fear of doing something normal, finger quotes. I don't want it to be an experience breaker. So I don't know if Warner Brothers was affected by it. In my personal opinion, I think it's very smart that they did what they did. Movies will survive. We have had 100-year history of always saying movies is going to be ruined by this. DVDs, movies are going to be ruined by this. VHS, movies are going to be ruined by home box office, HBO. Movie industry freaks out. We've been freaking out for decades now. One, the philosophy is if it's meant to be, it will happen. But I cannot see people not desiring that experience in the future. We might consolidate movies. They might not be mega. They might not be 14 films in a row, which I think is a bit ridiculous. We might slow down. We might come back to how it used to be, where one movie opens and it's a blockbuster, and that's the movie that plays for 3 weeks, 4 weeks before something else major opens. We might not be jamming it with everything that we have. We might simplify it, but the theater is an experience that can only happen in the theater. You can only have live theater, meaning plays, in that forum. So there's no way it's going to die out. It's just a matter of how much people feel they're safe enough to go because of the virus or because of their movie-going experience. Is it worth it? When it's worth it, people will come back. This was not the movie to do it. This was not the movie to do it. If Mary Poppins Returns hadn't opened, and they try to open it, it might have been a smarter move, only because of the joy and simplicity of that movie. Maybe not so great bringing kids to the theaters, but at this point, what movie really would do that for me? Not this one. I would have left. I would have left in 20 minutes because there are 3 major plot lines that have happened in 20 minutes of this film that need to be paid attention to for the rest of the movie. And I actually think that you're correct. I think Christopher Nolan believes his audience is smart enough to follow it, but my goodness gracious, a kid, Elizabeth Debicki's character, Kenneth Branagh's character, they go to India, they go bungee jumping upside down. I mean, it's just, it's like, whoa. Okay. And like I said, if you're not following, and I listened to it on headsets as I watched it, if you're not following, it's going to get dropped and you won't be as interested and as invested as you should be.
What did you think about John David Washington's performance as the protagonist? I know that Christopher Nolan is a huge James Bond fan, and I know that he's wanted to do a spy type movie, but I couldn't imagine a meeting of him and Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, the people who are producing the James Bond movies, and him being like, okay, here's what I want to do. I want to do a James Bond movie, but I want it to have all of these crazy temporal rules and all of this funky stuff. Like they would just tell him to leave. So it sounds like he's kind of tried to make his own James Bond movie, and he put John David Washington in the center of it, which I think is he's subtle in his performance, but it's also dynamic when necessary. So I thought that for me, the one part of his performance that I thought was remarkable, meaning I think that it bears remarking on, is his fight scene in the Italian kitchen. And the way that he carried himself was very calm and efficient. And as opposed to being flailing arms and roundhouse kicks and all kinds of stuff, he was only moving as necessary, which makes sense in a small environment like that, where he's having to fight like 3, 4, 5 guys. And he was able to be efficient with punches, efficient with using the things around him, including a cheese grater. And I thought that it was a really dynamic fight, even though he was very calm and controlled. And I thought that was, I don't know if that was his choice as an actor or if that was what he was instructed to do, but either way, it just came through as a confidence, which is difficult considering we are along for the ride with him in that he doesn't know necessarily what he's going to find when he tries to go find this Goya painting. He doesn't know what he's looking for. He doesn't know what it does. He does, we're learning along with him throughout this, especially the first half of the movie. And he's still able to kind of use his instincts as a spy to get out of a difficult situation. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. The first word that came to mind when you said, "What did you think?" Confident. He is 100% confident as an actor, at least seemingly so. He's very smooth. He's everything's purposeful, and I think that fight sequence is a good example of that. He is the character you have to believe knows one step before everybody else. So he has to have been able to see that cheese grater 30 seconds before that guy got hit by it. He had to have seen those plates, because that's when it was, very interesting. He's that guy. He knocks the plates off in front of him. There's no other thing he can do. That's the only thing he can do. But as an audience member, you don't see the plates until he starts to knock them over. And I think a split second before you do see them. And so he's smarter than the person in front of him, at least one step in front of them. And that's the kind of character that you need. The only thing that gets me about him is that if you're looking away when he starts to talk, he sounds like his dad.
Really?
Yeah, he
Okay.
definitely does. There are inflections and tones that sound. Now, he did a very good job in Black Klansman, but he also had to portray a white guy on the phone.
Yeah.
So I don't know if he did anything in particular to tone out certain things, or I'm not sure where he was born and raised, so his dialect might have nondescript things in it. But he had to convince you in Black Klansman that when he was talking on the phone that somebody would think he was a white guy. And there were moments when I would close my eyes during Black Klansman, at least the second time that I saw it, and I would think to myself, would I be convinced? And the answer is yes. I wouldn't have thought twice about it. I don't know if I would have tried to distinguish what his ethnic background was, but in this, for whatever reason, he doesn't look like his dad. There's a couple of shots where he's looking out the helicopter at one point. He's looking out the side of his gas mask, and it's from above. And he sort of looks like Denzel at that point, but not really. And see, I got used to him as an actor, John David Washington, because of Ballers on HBO. I started watching that show before I knew anything about the show. I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know who he's related to. And I was like, that guy's got a spark. Something's interesting about that guy. And he's a spitfire on the show. The character calls for it. And I just never realized who he was. And then I don't know if it was until Black Klansman that I actually put that together. I think it was Spike Lee talking about it. And it might have been Spike Lee talking about the Five Bloods, because they were supposed to play father and son in that. So yeah, I think his performance is, he's a leading man who doesn't want to be the leading man. Although when he says, I'm the protagonist, I mean, it takes a really skilled actor to pull something like that off without sounding as hokey as it sounds probably on the paper. I mean, because who calls himself the protagonist of anything? It's clever.
Well, Priya called him the protagonist. The Indian woman called him the protagonist when they met the first time, and that's when he kind of used
correct,
him. Yeah.
right, correct. But he does say it a couple more times, and it's a bit like calling yourself by your full name. I'm Paul James. Paul James says, although people do call me Paul James as if it's one name, but talking about yourself in third person is odd. So he pulls it off. And I also think that him always understanding one step ahead as a character helps you as an audience member catch up to anything that he's already one step ahead of you as a narrative goes. So I thought he was great. I thought everybody was great.
Yeah. Yeah, you got Elizabeth Debicki in there, Robert Pattinson, and then Kenneth Branagh, who you don't even see until like 30, 40 minutes into the movie. I purposely stayed away from all the Tenet stuff, so I don't think that I even knew that Kenneth Branagh was in it, but I did like how they teased his character where he would be on screen, but kind of, it'd be an over-the-shoulder shot of him looking at Elizabeth Debicki's character, Kat, or, him being kind of like this specter in the background and always talking about him and building up his character through the name, the Sator, and through what he's done and how just malicious he is, and then finally revealing him on the yacht there. It was pretty cool. I like that. That's kind of like some old school stuff where, like third man stuff where you don't see Orson Welles until, the end of the movie, and you've heard about Harry Lime for the last hour. So I did a little bit of research on the Priya character, which is the Indian arms dealer's wife, who I guess is also an arms dealer, and she's played by Dimple Kapadia, who's a very famous Indian actress. So I think that in India that's a huge deal that she's part of this international film, and I do think that was kind of cool.
Priya is actually the head of that arms dealer organization, and her husband Sanjay is just a cover. He's just because she says
Got it.
it's good to have a man's face in a man's world. She's the leader of that organization. She just needs her husband to pretend to be because they live in a man's world.
Yeah, okay. No, that's smart. The other thing I learned was that much like a James Bond movie, they kind of bounce around the globe in this film, which I think is really cool. And one of the settings is Mumbai, India. And I didn't know that Mumbai as a city hasn't really allowed many, at least American-based or European-based productions to do any kind of like aerial photography or aerial videography of their city. But there's some amazing IMAX shots of Mumbai just kind of flying through downtown Mumbai, India, and especially the one high rise that they're focused on, which is the residence of this Sanjay Singh and his wife Priya, the arms dealer. So I thought that was pretty cool that they were able to get access to that, and especially just the whole concept of doing the reverse bungee jumping thing is kind of neat. I didn't even know that they had things like that, but I guess those are real things that people can use. But yeah, the settings of this movie are vast and varied. And I thought that Nolan did a good job of finding interesting places to put on screen, whether it's a wind farm in the middle of the Baltic Sea off of Denmark, or even in the opera house at the beginning of the film.
That set piece is brilliant with those staircases that go up and down in the middle of the audience, and the back part where it drops down, and it's a sound barrier between the audience and the outside. I'm like, that place is cool.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so that was actually it's supposed to be in Kiev, Ukraine, but it was in Estonia, which is the same place they did the car chase in the middle of the film, or I guess a quarter of the way through the film and then 3/4 of the way through the film. But yeah, so that was really cool. The fact that they were able to utilize that same area, and the architecture there is just like super brutalist. I did a little bit of research on that and found that they used that in the 1980 Olympics. Even though it's Estonia now, which is its own country, Estonia was a part of the USSR at that time. So yeah, they built that, and then it's gone into disrepair. They had to completely like redo the interior of that. But it is interesting that, like you said, there's like that sound barrier that comes down, but the bad guys utilize that as a way to gas everybody, because otherwise it would just kind of like dissipate as it goes through the hallways and all the different areas. But that was a really cool set piece, I thought there. And then just going through the yacht, being able to have some scenes on that yacht, and the sailing was amazing. I didn't even know that was a thing, but there's like a whole sport that's that catamaran sailing, and it was just amazing. I thought some of that was CGI, but then I found out that I think it was 231 CGI shots or digital effect shots in this film. But you compare a movie like this, which is a huge, big budget movie, it should have way more than 200 CGI shots. But I think Christopher Nolan, once again, is very old school, and he wants to keep as much as possible on film. And I do feel like we kind of missed out not being able to see this movie in a theater, period. But even on IMAX, if you have access to an IMAX theater, I'm sure it was just absolutely beautiful. This movie was shot all on film. They didn't use any digital photography. They shot either on 65 millimeter with Panavision cameras, or some of the bigger scenes, like we talked about the Mumbai fly-in scene, and anything that's more like a vista, or the chase scenes or the battles at the end. That was all shot on IMAX cameras, which are also film cameras, but they have a much larger format for the film. And to the point where 1,000-foot magazine of film only will shoot for about 3 minutes. So I know that most actors are probably used to nowadays just like you turn on the camera and you can roll for an hour. But I can imagine the intensity that is felt on set, where it's like, okay, you've got 3 minutes to get this take and that's it. Especially certain scenes, like the scenes in the Freeport where there's the forward and backward fight scenes. You've got to be on point every time, and you're just burning money every time you shoot that. And so I can imagine that everybody's got to be on their A game to shoot those things. But I think that it does come across, even in a digital display format like you or I saw, at our house. But I don't know if you noticed, but the way you can tell the difference between the scenes that are shot in IMAX and the scenes that are shot with the traditional 65 millimeter Panavision cameras is the Panavision shots have the black bars on the top and the bottom of them. They don't fill the whole screen, the whole 16:9 TV, like your whole screen of TV, because it's a wider format. But with IMAX, it's like this huge, tall screen, and they try to kind of replicate that a little bit with the at-home formats, Blu-rays and 4K UHD discs, where they will fill the whole frame with the picture. And so it makes for just larger vista shots or more dynamic action shots. And so you can kind of see, like next time you watch it, which hopefully you'll watch it again. Next time you watch it, you'll see the difference between those two different formats. But I was impressed with the amount of IMAX footage that they shot. I know they shot a lot for Dunkirk also, but usually IMAX is only meant for very certain scenes. I know that Mission Impossible has used IMAX cameras before, and other movies have used it, but they'll use it for like the scene where Tom Cruise is hanging on the side of the airplane and they're taking off and he's, dangling off the side of the airplane. They'll use it for something like that. They won't use it for the scene when Benji's hacking into something. It's just not worth it. But in this movie, they use the IMAX cameras for a lot more than what I thought. But the other thing I was impressed with is the cinematographer is Hoyte van Hoytema, who I believe has won an Academy Award. I think he won an Academy Award for he has shot a Bond movie though. So he's shot a bunch of different films and has worked with Christopher Nolan before because he shot Dunkirk and he's also shot Interstellar.
He only has one Academy Award nomination, and that's for Dunkirk. He has not won.
Yeah, well, but that's okay. It's still impressive work. But he also shot a Bond movie too, which was interesting. He shot the most recent Bond movie, Spectre. Well, the most recent Bond movie to come out, Spectre. And he also shot Her, which was really cool. I remember talking about that and talking about some of the cinematography for Her. But anyway, so in the shots where they were handheld shots, even with the IMAX cameras, he likes to operate the camera. So you'll see this director of photography who puts this huge camera on his shoulder. And then we're talking like 3.5 feet long type camera on his shoulder. And he's carrying it around. A lot of times DPs will just set the lights, help the director pick lenses and then step back and allow a camera operator to do that. But he likes to kind of get in there and look through the viewfinder and actually see the shot as it's happening. So that's some dedication right there. I thought that was really cool, especially seeing it in the behind the scenes footage. It's like, man, this he's working hard, and he was there every day just putting in the time. And I think the film looks great, and it has a lot to say with what he does, and also the choices that Christopher Nolan's making.
Agreed. But I'm also wondering, when I go back and watch it a second time, I'm sure I will, just out of curiosity to see what I'm going to look at. You know what I mean? Like, where am I going to focus? Am I going to try to focus on plot lines that I might have missed? Am I going to focus on time things? What am I going to focus on? It might not be an exercise in storytelling the second time. It might be just an exercise in technology. But it seems to be that the cinematography in places when things were inverted, which I love that they use that term instead of reversed. Is there a way to tell you're in inverted time by the cinematography and the way that the film looks versus regular time or present day moments? Do they do different things with the angles and the shots, but do they also do things with what they chose colorization wise with cinematography? Does it look different? Is it more of a faded blue in the sky when you're looking at the reverse thing when they're on the boat and the boat's going back in time, or it's inverted?
It's not going back in time.
Yeah, it's not going back in time, right? As soon as I said that, I was like, yeah, what? So is the cinematography on the water different than if it was not inverted?
I don't think that's the case, but I do know that when we'll take the Freeport fight between the protagonist and his inverted self as an example, the first time we see that fight, I mean, it only happens once, but we as an audience see it twice from two different points of view. And it's performed twice. It's choreographed so well that we're able to have John David Washington be both characters, and we're able to see it from two different angles. So the first time we see it, our viewpoint is from the viewpoint of the unmasked, non-inverted John David Washington. And the second time we see it, it's from the point of view of the masked, inverted John David Washington. And it takes on a different feeling the second time. It's a little bit closer the second time we see it. The shot framing is a little bit closer the second time we see it. And it's also pointing out certain things. The first time we see it, there's a part in the fight scene where they're in the hallway and the non-inverted, non-suited up John David Washington tries to punch the other guy and he just gets blocked. And you're just like, man, this other guy is like an amazing fighter. And then the second time we see it, they kind of give you a little bit of a view into his, you can see kind of his eyes at a particular point in that fight right before that interchange happens. And he kind of realizes that he knows exactly what the person he's fighting, who is himself, is going to do. And he's able to block those punches because he knows that the person that he's fighting is going to attempt those punches in that order. So we're learning along with the masked protagonist, the masked inverted protagonist. And the way that they drive that fact home is by changing the angle of the camera and adjusting the framing of the camera.
Yeah, but it doesn't take you out of realizing that's what you're watching. And then when you're watching the first time, it seems a little awkward because obviously there's some reverse movement and there's some kind of anticipatory movements that you were speaking of. See, that's the concept that I was having kind of a hard time with, is that when you're doing inverted fight sequences, it kind of seems like you're doing a practice fight scene. And so when you're pulling a punch versus punching somebody in reverse in real time, it looks like you're choreographed the fight. Well, obviously it is choreographed because it's already happened, blah, blah, blah. So it's mind bending and not necessarily in the best way. I guess you just have to sit back and take it in for what it is instead of trying to understand it at the moment.
It's not an inverted fight sequence. That's the key. It's you have a fight sequence between one person who is moving forward in their life and they are experiencing the other person as if they are moving backwards in their life.
See, that's hard for me.
Yeah.
So when they're setting up the plane to crash into the building and cause all that stuff that they cause, when they're running towards the plane and everybody else is running backwards, does that mean everybody running backwards sees them running backwards?
Yes, they do. But there's so much chaos that that the other people are probably not paying as much attention to them.
I would challenge this film to prove that doesn't happen 100% of the time where somebody wouldn't have noticed it. There's a few times when they're doing stuff inverted where in real time I think people would have noticed. And obviously, like with the car crash on the interstate, you see that before it happens and then it plays back. It's very satisfying finally getting filled in with what actually happened when you're watching it the first time. Okay, so my question is this. She says, I can't remember, it's the scientist in the beginning who says, don't come in contact with your inverted self because molecules. That's what they say, because of molecules. But they do come in contact with each other.
He's wearing a suit.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Well, see, I call movie fact on that one. I call movie theory on that one.
Oh, yeah.
Only in a movie.
The breathing is a movie fact, too. The whole, like, breathing and you can't breathe in the molecules because you can't inverted breathe in the non-inverted molecules. Like, all of that's expositionary signposting. That is particularly meant to help us to understand that a person is wearing a mask, they're inverted.
Gotcha. No, I got it. Just like the red bands and the blue bands. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
But molecules are everything. So touching a skin molecule versus touching a clothes molecule, you're still touching a molecule. So if you're not supposed to come in contact with your other self, your clothes should not be a barricade.
Well, I've already got...
Shut up, simple one, and listen to Josh. Okay, so go ahead.
No, really, I think that you could say that the suit could have two different elements. The inner element could be an inverted piece of clothing, and the outer element could be a non-inverted piece of clothing. So that your other person could touch the outer part of the clothing that is non-inverted, and then the inner part is touching you, which is inverted.
But they don't talk about that in the movie. Okay. But what they do
Okay.
talk about is don't come in contact with yourself, molecules.
That's right.
So that sets you up for something
unless you're
that they
wearing a
never,
suit.
Right. But then you need to, if you're going to explain everything else in this movie, you're going to have to explain something that was so definitive. Don't come in contact with yourself. And that's to deal with the paradox theories that everybody's going to come up with. And this couldn't have happened because blah, blah, blah. And side note, we'll actually jump off subject. Why is this not a time travel film?
It's because everything that has happened, which they say multiple times in the film.
But they're able to change things in the past by doing things in the future and vice versa. Yeah.
They already happened.
But they changed the destiny of Kenneth Branagh's character by making him
they don't.
not kill himself. In another world,
There is no other world. She was always going to kill him.
Well, he
Everything was
dies.
always going to happen the way that it happened.
they thought that he killed himself, but they didn't know that she had killed him because they wouldn't have had that knowledge.
Yes, his plan was to kill himself, but he needed to think that the algorithm was in the place that was going to get blown up so that it was going to be covered up for people to recover in the future. Like that's what he needed to think. It's all about the information that a person sees or information a person has access to versus what is actually happening. And even though you might think that something is going on, if you don't know exactly what's going on, then that information is not going to force you to quote unquote change your mind. And that's why Robert Pattinson says about 3/4 of the way through the movie, he's like, our policy as part of this group that has the name Tenet, our policy is suppression of knowledge, not knowing anything. And in fact, the scientist at the beginning, she's like, hey, what it's about, not my problem. The least I know, the better. Here's what I know, and here's what you need to know. And then that happens throughout the movie. In fact, at one point, well, it's when they're in the shipping container and they're inverted and they're relocating themselves back a week to be able to help Elizabeth Debicki uninvert to get the bullet out of her. If they know of the turnstile being available a week ago, they have to live a week of their life inverted in that shipping container, and they have to be transported to the Oslo airport, which is where the turnstile is. So while they're in that shipping container, he's asking him, who hired you? What's your backstory? Where are you from? And Robert Pattinson's like, you don't need to know that. The least you know, the better, because whatever I say could potentially cause some sort of temporal misplacement, could cause you to change something. So, and ultimately, when they go back through, when they start talking about the grandfather paradox in this same shipping container, John David Washington says this, just the fact that we're sitting here and talking about this and that we're not dead, doesn't that mean that we succeeded? And he's like, well, that's the optimist view of it. But if you start getting into multiple timelines or multiple universes, or I guess multiverses, then there's an offshoot. There's an alternate 1985 where Biff is the head of a casino. It's that kind of a thing in Back to the Future. So if it's one of those things, then yeah, but that's not what this movie is. Now that we've seen the whole movie and now that we know the whole plot front to back, this whole movie is a contained singular universe. But the people in the middle of it, they don't know that. They don't have the knowledge of that. So it's really cool.
It's definitely intriguing how much my mind is trying to grapple with this right now, because you're saying it's not a time travel movie, but they go back a week to change something.
It's not.
Okay, calm down, Defenso. Okay, I know you're on the thing of wanting to defend that this is not a time travel film, but if you were to take what you just described out of the podcast and just play it for somebody, they would say he's talking about a time travel movie. That's how it comes across. And I also think it's a little bit, I think it's clever and also a cheap shot at the same time when the scientist says, well, I'm not supposed to know that kind of stuff. I'm only supposed to know this. Well, then that stops the audience from questioning why she doesn't know that. And that's a plug and a period to a sentence, so we don't have to ponder that anymore. Watch out for your molecules. They'll come in contact with each other. That's a plug and into a possible plot hole. And I think it's awfully convenient to say, oh, well, that's the optimistic way to look at it. But don't worry about the pessimistic way to look at it, because that's multi-universe. So it's like, wait, okay, is that a plug in a plot hole, or is that just an easily excused idea that doesn't fully form out?
Well, if the protagonist would have said, just the fact that we're sitting here talking, doesn't that mean that we succeeded? And Robert Pattinson said, yeah, we succeeded. So now that there are no stakes at the end of the film, in the battle sequence at the end of the film, there's no stakes because you know they've succeeded. There need to still be, as an audience, there need to be stakes.
Right, totally. But that's still a plot hole. You puttied a plot hole. You put a little putty in it. It's not dry yet,
Sure.
and it's still malleable, but it's still putty in a hole that could possibly be a end to a movie that you already know the ending to. So yes, it is exactly what I'm describing it to be. Then at the end, if he's in the middle of his journey, which you find out at the end, he's in the middle of it, he is told things at the end of the film that contradict what Robert Pattinson says. Because he says we shouldn't tell anybody. Our theory is to squash things or to suppress things, okay? He doesn't suppress anything at the end. He allows John David Washington to put it together. What's happening? Oh, you hired me. Oh, I already knew about all of this. I came up with Tenet. Oh, okay. By the way, there are things in this movie that seem to be set up for a sequel, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I think so.
The ending is one of them. The thought of it is obviously the entertaining part for me. The idea and the concept behind reversal or inverted, which I think is a much better word than reversing, is mind-boggling in itself. But to actually have a conversation about the grandfather paradox as a way to get to the ending of the movie so you don't know how the movie's going to end is actually, it's too complex for me. It's too early in the afternoon.
Well, first of all, I don't know if they would make a sequel, and if they did, it probably would not be a $200 million movie. But I don't know if it would be interesting. So at the end of the movie, we know that the protagonist is only halfway through his journey because he still has not, quote unquote, created Tenet, the group or the movement that is Tenet. And the fact that we could see all that happen, I don't know if that would be satisfying or not, because yeah, I mean, maybe there's other things that are going to go on, but I don't know if it would really be worth it. But more interesting to me is the fact that there are theories out there that Neil, the Robert Pattinson character, is actually Kat's son, Kat and Sator's son.
See, that to me is interesting, but it also proves to me that the movie is too complicated for its own good, because when you get to the end of the film, you have to remember that he gave her an answering service to call if there was any problems, and obviously there was a problem, so she called him, but he got that in inverted time, so he got it beforehand, so he was able to stop something bad from happening to her outside her son's school at the end of the film. It's so complex up to that point that I think that moment is dropped a little bit because you're so still trying to figure out everything you've watched up to that point.
It's just a regular phone, but when she calls and leaves the message, so let's say she calls him and leaves a message on a Thursday, and then he's living his life that Thursday, and then he looks down and like Friday morning, he's like, oh, I got a message from Elizabeth Debicki. Awesome. And he listens to it, and she gives him a time and a date and a location. And he knows exactly when she called, and he knows what the location is. But she called him yesterday. And so he's looking at his phone on Friday, and he's like, all right, well, I'm going to go to a turnstile. It's Friday now. She called him on Thursday. It's Friday. So he's like, I'm going to go to a turnstile, and I'm going to get in that turnstile, and then I'm going to be inverted when I come out of the turnstile on Friday, and he's going to live a day where the world is backwards to him, and he is going to move back to Thursday inverted, or he'll whatever, come out of the turnstile and go to a hotel or go to a room and just sit in that room until it's Thursday. And then he's going to go back through the turnstile and on Thursday before the time that Elizabeth Debicki called him. And then it's going to allow him to get in the back of the car, kill Priya and kill the henchman. So that's how that mechanic works.
So is he inverted in that scene, or no? He inverted himself and then went back.
He can't be inverted in that scene. Yeah, he can't be inverted in that scene because he's not wearing the air. He's going into that turnstile for a day so that he can go back, quote unquote, go back to Thursday. But he's just living a day, and then when he goes back out the turnstile and he's not inverted, it's Thursday. But it's so the key is that let's say he was in Mumbai on Thursday. And he got the phone call. So then he would have flown on Friday to London, gone into a turnstile on Friday, and then moved back to Thursday, inverted, and then become uninverted on Thursday. And then he's there and he's killing Priya. So there's two of him on Thursday. There's the version of him that is in Mumbai on Thursday, and there's the version of him that is in London on Thursday. But they will end up coming back together because he'll go back through the turnstile.
Okay, I strangely understand that, but I also implore you that when you edit this podcast and you're looking at our words on the screen, because that's how you edit our podcast, and you go to read what you just said, have somebody else read it and see if they're not like, what are you talking about? And I swear the first thing they're going to say is, this a time travel movie? Because that sounds like you.
Nope.
I understand. You can't even let me say it without you shaking your head. I'm wondering if my mind is not able to follow these complex ideas. But I do know this: if my mind is not able to follow these complex ideas, I certainly will try to figure it out. But that, to me, stops the narrative. Everything comes to a ceasing halt when I'm trying to figure out what I just watched. And you got to make sure that whatever idea or world building idea that you've come up with doesn't slow down the storytelling process to where people are trying to ponder what they just saw. And he's done it very successfully, like in Memento, and not as successful in Insomnia. Although Memento is a time bending type thing anyway, or memory bending thing, and Insomnia isn't. So he's done it really well to where the concept only fueled the narrative. For me, in this film, the concept is brilliant and I'm trying to figure it out, but that doesn't add to an easygoing movie experience.
You know, I'm starting to understand that Christopher Nolan, in this movie, he's trying to put a character of a movie in the same scenario that we as audiences are in movies like Memento, where in Memento, we as an audience are experiencing a timeline moving forward in chunks of time that are being revealed to us in a reverse scenario. So Memento starts with all the black and white stuff moving forward and all of the color stuff in chunks moving backwards. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, it depends,
And then
because
they
it's an
meet
unreliable narrator. You don't know.
narrator. Yeah. So,
Yeah, you
but,
don't
but
know.
either way, the end of the film is the middle of that character's arc, is the middle of that character's story for us. And very similarly, that's the same setup of this film as far as a character arc throughout a whole story. But so I think that in that film, the character has to live life linearly with relation to time, because that's just how everyone lives life. But he's trying to put, in Tenet, he's trying to put the main character in the same scenario that we as an audience were in Memento. And I think that's really cool. And we're kind of along with the character in this film and learning things, especially the first half of the movie. We're learning things along with him. And he constantly has to fight against asking questions, which I think is maybe what Christopher Nolan wants all of his audience to do. It's like, don't ask questions, just like let it wash over you. And then after the whole movie's over, now go back and ask questions. But I could see where people would get super frustrated if they were constantly asking questions, especially through the first half of this film. And I could totally see where you would just check out and be like, nobody's answering my questions. All I have is more questions. Every scene is more questions. And I don't want to deal with it anymore. So it's a risk. It's a roll of the dice to keep adding and adding and adding more questions until you get to the end of the film. And then you're able to go back and piece all of it together. It's kind of like doing a jigsaw puzzle where you get like one piece every 5 minutes, and you get an hour into it and you're like, I don't even have enough pieces to know what this is supposed to even look like. And every piece you get makes it more complex and more complex. But by the end of this film, you've got all the pieces. Now you have to put it together. And that may seem a little unsatisfying for certain moviegoers.
I wouldn't use the word unsatisfying. I think what you just said makes a lot of sense, in that there are a lot of questions. I don't need the questions to be answered per se. I think posing a question is an interesting thing in a movie or in a piece of art. Having the answers to the questions with what I think might be the way that it is versus the movie thinks that that's the way that it is versus that inverted time thinks it is. Usually, like in Memento, when you're being posed so many questions at one time, you never lose track of trying to figure it out as an audience member. even if you're not getting your questions answered per se. And I would say the same thing in Insomnia too. And I would even say the same thing in The Dark Knight. He does sort of this complex action film inside of an actually deep, drawn out character study, be it the Jokers or the Dark Knights at that point, or even Two Faces at that point. But you keep enjoying the process of trying to figure out the questions and the answers throughout the whole film in Memento, The Dark Knight, so forth and so on. In this one, it stops it in its track. And you trying to figure out the question becomes the process of watching the film, not allowing the film to wash over you and just have maybe no answers to those questions, that just posing the questions is what's interesting. I think it turns in on itself at the end, though, when he does answer a question, or at least poses a question that can only be answered one way. And that's with that tethered red string with whatever is on it. It looks like a washer or something like that. So I don't know. Interesting.
So what did you think about the action sequences? Were they dynamic? It's stuff that we don't necessarily see on screen very often. Reverse effects, car chases backwards, those types of things. I thought that it was almost all that stuff was done in camera. I mean, I think all the car chase was done in camera, and they had to do some extreme things like take a car that is meant to go forward at a very high speed and completely reverse the drivetrain to allow for the car to go at those high speeds backwards, quote unquote. And they flip the driver's seat so that like the driver's looking out the back window, and it's all tinted and all that stuff. So they had to modify a lot of things to allow for the stunt drivers to do these things. And they closed down a whole, like, and it was like 8 kilometers worth of highway in Estonia to do these scenes, and they did it for weeks. And so I thought like, if you're going to do it, they're doing it. And so that was so cool. I mean, compared to something like The Matrix, where they had a 1 mile stretch of road or something, it's a totally different thing. I guess it was Matrix Reloaded, where they had a 1 mile stretch of road that they could do whatever they wanted on it. This one, they just like shut it all down, and they had all that time to kind of play and figure stuff out. But those scenes, I thought, were the chase scene, I thought was really impressive. And then also the fight scene was amazing too. And the way that they shot that was they would fight and they would shoot it in reverse, and they would reverse the film. And then there was like multiple ways that they were able to display the fight to us. And they tried to make it seem as if the fight was happening where one person is moving forward and the other person is moving backwards. But really the stunt performers and John David Washington had to act like they were moving forward, even if they were moving backwards. So that was really cool. I mean, we haven't really talked about the blockbuster style filmmaking that this is, and whether that was satisfying to you or whether you were still caught up in turnstiles and inversion.
Yeah, all of the above. I started the podcast out with saying it's an intellectual action film, and that's what it is. And the sequences are interesting. And maybe this is my mind. When I'm watching those fight sequences, I am trying to figure out how they did it versus letting it flow so I can figure out what it means in the narrative of the movie. And there's a couple times, and we just talked about this a little while ago, where, having done some stunts on stage, nothing major, having done some small fight sequences on stage, you learn that the person receiving the punch is the person who's selling the punch. In other words, you're not really hitting somebody. The person is reacting as if you're hitting them. So it is definitely, it's the opposite of what you would think instinctually a fight would be, because it is. So it would be very interesting and very confusing and very challenging in the best kind of way to come to work saying, okay, today I am reversed. So that means I went this way, and then the next day I am in regular time or regular non-inverted atmospheres. And I'm trying to not say time, by the way. And it would be interesting. But there are some times in some of those sequences where I'm paying attention to the gimmick more so than paying attention to what exactly needs to happen through the gimmick. So that means that you're running backwards in time or inverted, and you're running backwards, even though everybody's running forward, just like you're seeing them run backwards and you're running forward. So they're seeing two men and a gurney run backwards in front of them, even though everything's confusing, and that's how they cover it. And then there were times when they were fighting it, it looks like you got to see what it was like for the other person who's getting punched in a fight sequence, what they have to do to sell the punch. It looked like, of course, you have to pull your punches, obviously. You have to pull them backwards instead of going forward. And that looks a little awkward to the eye when it's not done in reverse. In other words, if John David Washington, who pulls it off brilliantly, by the way, his confidence as an action hero is brilliant. Like just the way he walks. I'm like, okay, I believe he could do what he's getting ready to do. And he sells it. But because they had to film some things as if he was reversing them himself and then not use the technique of speeding it, making it go forward because you needed to see what it looked like in reverse, it did look staged. It did look unusual to the eye. So if you were to just take that sequence out of the film and show it to somebody, it would look odd. In the tent of this movie, it doesn't look odd because you're understanding the concept. I don't know if that makes sense, but he blows some really cool stuff up and I'm good with it.
Well, yeah. And that being said, I mean, the whole final scene of the film is kind of a culmination of all these things. It's like we've seen kind of a little bit of small reverse, what seems like things happening in reverse in your world, but now they just turn it up to 11 at the final battle scene, where there's inverted rounds and regular rounds and inverted bazookas and regular bazookas. And it's just, just some of the scenes, seeing the Humvee driving through and you see like the Humvee will be driving and then there'll be like an explosion that actually gets sucked in front of the Humvee, and then another explosion that looks like it's exploding behind the Humvee. So it's just these kind of like very, and I don't even know how they did those. Those are probably visual effects, I would guess. Maybe it's really difficult to tell because I don't know how you would be able to run anything with smoke or anything with water or anything like that. You can't do it backwards. So you can have a string and pull a gun across the floor and make it look like you pushed it, but you can't do a reverse explosion practically. I'm sure there were certain things where it's like, okay, we're going to shoot this. We're gonna lock off the camera. We're gonna shoot one where there's explosions, and then we're gonna reverse the film, which they actually did run the film in reverse, which I thought was a little bit insane, since they could just as easily scan it into a computer and then be able to take the film that was scanned to the computer and then just run the digital file backwards. That's a pretty normal thing to be able to do in an editor, but they were very specific about, from what I've read, they edited this movie on film, that's dedication right there. They didn't do any kind of digital intermediate for any of the scenes that didn't need computer graphics. So that's pretty crazy. So they also did dailies too. They had a guy on set that would set up wherever they were. If they were in Estonia or if they were in Italy or wherever, he would find a gymnasium or something and set up a 65 millimeter film projector and would display dailies from the day before. And it was like old timey film type stuff. Nowadays, people are watching dailies on their computers, but they were doing it up. So, I mean, it is definitely the dedicated craft of filmmaking. But either way, that final scene, that final battle scene, there's just so much information, visual information. The first time I watched it, I had no idea who was going where and what was doing what. But the second time, I was able to kind of hone in on certain things and certain kind of interesting conundrums that happen when you've got these normal rounds and inverted rounds, like things like if somebody who's live and they're in a building that's already been blown up, but then an inverted round hits that building, you're now encased in that building. I mean, it's stuff like that was just crazy. So yeah, it seems like they're like, what are the weirdest, most awkward, interesting, and non-normal battle sequence items that we can throw into here and make it seem really interesting. I thought that was cool and engaging. And then it also did, especially with the clocks, the countdown clocks, the 10-minute watches that they kept referencing, it helped to propel the scene forward along with all the other stuff that's going on. And you're right. Initially, you're kind of like, why are these people in these containers? Why are the blue people in the blue containers? And But after watching it again, it makes a lot of sense. But you got to do some homework, I guess. So I can understand why it might be frustrating.
All right. So, yeah, I agree with you that when you first watch it, you have to, I'm sure second time you watch it, you can kind of figure out red team, blue team, that kind of stuff, inverted bullets. The sequence with the implosion or inverted explosion and the person gets trapped in the building, in the wall. That's all really cool. I actually think we needed more of that stuff, more of those mind-blowing concepts. Those things like lit me up when you see those things happening. When you see the smoke and the whole idea of fire turns to cold if it's inverted, which is great. It's a great concept. And I'm wondering that if the plot wasn't so complex, that's not a criticism, that's a compliment. But if it wasn't so complex, maybe we could have had more of those visually stunning things. Not what they did wasn't impressive already. It was majorly impressive. Those are the things that kept me injuvenated during the film. Like the actual idea of that concept. And when that happened, you immediately didn't need any explanation of why that building all of a sudden formed around that person. You understood it because the concept that has already been placed in your mind, inversion, is solid at that point. So yeah, I thought that was well done. I think the action sequences are well done. I just think there's like one or two more of those concepts of where you could really press it home. And they've done a ton. Don't get me wrong. They spent millions of dollars in 2.5 hours of doing a lot of them. And of course I want more, but that's a compliment because they're so interesting. And the concept of it is so interesting that you want to see more. That's why when you see the bullet in reverse in the beginning of the film versus the second time you see it, it's way more interesting because you can focus on how the cement solidifies itself again and the bullet comes out, in reverse, obviously. And so it's interesting.
Yeah. He kind of like starts peppering, you've got one bullet in the first scene and then you start seeing the fight scene. You see a couple of other things, whether it's the bullets hitting the bulletproof glass in the Freeport during the fight scene in the Freeport, and then the car chase, you have the car flipping. I mean, there's certain kind of like main points in which you see dynamic changes. And by the time you get to the end of the film, they're just all over the place. I thought that the way that that the film is structured is it's kind of like the beginning of the film is one side of a wedge, and they talk about this, the temporal pincher movement. The beginning of the film is one side of the wedge, and where Robert Pattinson is at the beginning of the film, which is in the opera house, is the other side of the wedge, and they're both like pretty much like Robert Pattinson and John David Washington are coming to an apex point at the end of the film, and that's the point at which Neil, Robert Pattinson's character, dies. So yeah, I mean that right there is really cool.
Okay, but if the protagonist tells Neil that he gets shot at the opera house, and to prevent that, how did he tell him that if he got shot? Because wouldn't he be dead?
Robert Pattinson knows that someone stops John David Washington from getting shot. And John David Washington sees the token on the backpack of Robert Pattinson. First of all, let's go back to the fact that everything that has happened has happened. That is the most important thing about this whole complex situation. Everything that has happened has happened. And so John David Washington, as the protagonist, in off screen, sometime in his linear life after this movie ends, is going to meet Robert Pattinson. After this movie ends, is going to meet Robert Pattinson. Robert Pattinson's life ends at the end of this film, but that doesn't mean that he is not in the world in linear time after this film ends, because he spends a portion of his life inverted, moving towards years that have happened for other people who are not inverted. So every year, like if it's me and you live your linear time and I invert myself starting in 2020 and I live inverted for a year, when I uninvert myself, it will be 2019. It will be December 2019 when I uninvert myself.
Well, first of all, why would anybody do that, considering 2020 has been the year that it's been? I get what you're saying, but yeah, my mind is not about that. My mind is avoiding a pandemic.
That's right.
Okay, I understand that. So because Robert Pattinson knew that he got saved because the protagonist tells him that somewhere in linear time, he spends a certain amount of time in inverted time, which puts him in a position to be there to save him from that shot to begin with, although it was him to begin with. Okay, that's just, it's almost too much. It's too much.
Yeah, he knew it was going to be him because it was always him. It's already happened. Everything that the protagonist does, everything that Sator does, even when trying to utilize the turnstiles and trying to utilize inverted time to get a leg up on the other person. For example, the first time we get to see the protagonist experience inverted time, where he's got the mask on and he's like, I'm going to go back to the car chase in an inverted state and try to get the ninth piece of the algorithm from Sator. Like, I'm going to try to recover that. And he realizes while he's trying to navigate living in this backwards world to him, while he's inverted, that he realizes that the algorithm was always going to get to Sator because that's the inevitability of this plan. And you notice that Eves, the Aaron Taylor Johnson, and the people around him are like, you're crazy. Why are you going out into the world inverted to try to change something? Like, you can't do it. But the protagonist has to prove to himself, or he thinks that he can change an outcome. But through going through the world in an inverted state, he realizes that he's not going to be able to change the outcome. Sator still gets the algorithm, and Sator still moves forward with his plan.
Okay.
I'll send you a diagram. It's really good.
You're going to have to break it down, because isn't that what they essentially do with her being shot? Is they invert their time.
So, yes, she heals better. They get her back to where she's not inverted anymore, so that she can heal in a traditional way from a gunshot wound, as opposed to not being able to heal. That is one of my biggest problems with this movie, is that if they didn't know that she was integral to the whole project, integral to the outcome of the situation, they should have just let her die, because she's just expendable, essentially. He even says, it's standard operating procedure. I knew he was going to shoot her anyway. I gave Sator bad information as to where the algorithm was. And so he knew she was going to get shot, and he was fine with it. But then all of a sudden it's kind of like, ooh, we need to save her. So that's a little wonky to me, but it gives the impetus to be inverted, for all of them to be inverted, and to go to the Oslo Freeport to use that turnstile, because they know that turnstile is available. So it's weird, but they're having to think not in linear time. They're having to think outside of linear time and figure out not necessarily like where location wise, but also where in linear time they can utilize something that they know is not being used. So yeah,
It's interesting. It's too complex.
I think that's a fine place to end it. This is infinitely discussable, and I think I've already had discussions at work about it, and I think it's super fun. And I think drawing it out actually really helps to understand, at least for me. Like, I looked at diagrams, but then I drew it myself, and I was like, okay, I understand it better now. It's a fun little exercise. But anyway, all right. Well, you can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. You can go to facebook.com/actorandengineer, and you can tweet us at actorengineer. And you can find us on YouTube. And just search for Actor and Engineer. I'll see you next time.